Hi everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. I know it's a busy time of the year, so we do really appreciate you taking the time. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Louise Reed, the Managing Director here at CML, and I'll be hosting today's webinar, our second Ask Me Anything session. We've really designed it to be practical and interactive, building on all the conversations, questions, and sometimes confusion that have come up since the first webinar. I think it's fair to say that the last couple of weeks have kept everyone in the world of immigration very busy, so I'm very grateful that Juliette Gilbert, our immigration consultant, is joining us today. Juliette leads our Immigration Services Department and has over 14 years experience with Cayman Islands immigration law and processes. And I suspect many of you on the call today will either already know her or have already worked with her. She's very much been at the front line of all of this, bless her. And so she's going to help us translate these changes in a practical way and what it means in practice and not just what we can see written down. So just quickly on format before we start, we've tried to keep it very simple. I'll guide us through the key themes from the questions that you very kindly sent in before the call, and Juliette's going to take us through some practical answers. If anything comes to mind as we go along, please do pop it in the Q&A section. You can do that confidentially or for the whole group, whichever you prefer. And I'm going to do my real best to keep an eye on them and continue to talk and cover as many as I can. But if we don't get to everything today, which is quite possible given the volume of questions we've had prior to the call, we will reach out to you afterwards. So one important note first. Today is focused specifically on work permit changes and not residency or status pathways, which we are going to cover separately. And you will hear throughout, there is still some transitional uncertainty. So we'll be sharing practical guidance based on what we know today and what we're seeing, but we will try and make sure that we flag any of those areas that are still evolving. So with that in mind, we'll get into it. Wait for the slide to come up. Okay, so Juliette, before we dive into the real detail, at a high level, how should employers be thinking about this new framework? Is it more of a tweak, or are we seeing a real fundamental shift here?
Yeah, thanks, Lou. I'd probably frame it as more of a fundamental shift rather than just a minor tweak. Even though some of the day-to-day processes will still feel familiar operationally. So what seems to be changing is the overall philosophy of the framework, and there's clearly a greater emphasis on things like genuine Caymanian recruitment efforts, ongoing compliance and reporting, stronger workforce planning overall, and tighter controls around mobility and long-term pathways. So probably most importantly, this does feel like a shift between more tighter processes, documentation, and general accountability across the board. Employers are going to be increasingly expected to evidence decisions properly and maintain stronger records throughout the process. And it's going to be throughout the process, not just at point of application.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I certainly think it's not something that anybody can afford to ignore at the moment. So let's start with probably the biggest immediate change that we've seen, and that's in advertising. So the questions that we got before the call were all really centered around, in general, what's changing with the requirements.
Yeah, so the biggest practical change is the advertising requirement itself. Everyone will be familiar with the 14-day Jobs Cayman requirement, but this has now changed to 21 consecutive days on the Jobs Cayman portal, and also 21 consecutive days in the newspaper. So what that means practically is you need to advertise for 3 weeks, so one advert a week in the newspaper. I will caveat that by saying there is a grace period for this 21 days. So any applications that are going in after the 21st of May, you absolutely have to stick to the 21 days. But before that, you can submit applications for the 14-day advertising. So what this is, there's a much greater emphasis on demonstrating a genuine recruitment process rather than just placing an advert. So employers need to be thinking about whether the job title accurately reflects the role, whether the job description and salary are realistic and defensible, whether Caymanian applicants were properly reviewed and documented, and whether there's a clear rationale if an Caymanian applicant was not considered or not considered suitable. So in practice,
Sorry, everyone, we seem to have lost Juliette for some strange reason. Just give us a few minutes to try and get her back. I can see a couple of questions have come through, so I will put those to Juliette in a moment as well about temporary work permits. All right, sorry about that, everyone. We're going old-fashioned. Jules is here in person. Could somebody just put it out? There we go. We've got a smiley face. That's good. I was just about to say, can everybody see us? Okay, so we're getting cozy and comfortable. Okay, so I'm not sure where we lost you there, but I think it was just when you were talking through sort of the tighter processes.
okay, so the changes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So what I was saying is I would frame it as more of a fundamental shift in direction rather than a minor tweak. So even though some of the day-to-day processes will still feel familiar operationally, what seems to be changing is the overall philosophy behind the framework. So there's obviously going to be clearer emphasis on genuine Caymanian recruitment efforts, ongoing compliance and reporting, tighter controls around mobility and long-term pathways, and stronger workforce planning overall. And perhaps most importantly, this does feel like a shift between tighter processes, documentation and accountability across the board. So employers can be expected to evidence decisions properly and maintain stronger records throughout the process, not just at the point of application.
Yeah, and if you didn't hear me before, I said we can't ignore it. It's certainly something we need to be thinking about. So then moved on to advertising requirements because we saw a lot of questions come through on that. And I think that's the biggest immediate change that we're seeing. Can you talk us through what we're seeing changes there?
Yeah, so the biggest practical change is the advertising requirement itself. So everybody knows about the 14-day jobs Cayman process, but this is changing to 21 days.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be 21 days on the Jobs Cayman portal, but also 21 days in a local newspaper. And what that means is that you would have to put in three adverts over a 21-day consecutive period. And I will caveat that by saying right now there is a grace period of 21 days. So anything after the 21st of May is absolutely, you have to adhere to this.
Okay.
So this is about demonstrating a genuine recruitment process rather than just posting an ad. So employers need to think very carefully about whether the job title accurately reflects the role, whether the job description and salary are realistic and defensible, whether Caymanian applicants were properly reviewed and documented, and where there was a Caymanian applicant, whether, and if they weren't considered suitable, whether there's clear rationale for that. Okay. So in practice, we're continuing to advise clients on the basis to treat recruitment documentation as part of the application.
Absolutely. And as we had the break, we've had two questions come in, so you don't escape now.
There we go.
So the first one was, it says, can we put in a, it says that the document has to be complete the full 21 days before submission. So I'm taking from that they mean, can you put a permit application in without a full application? Because I think in the past it perhaps did happen. You could put it in and follow up with an advert later.
Absolutely. So employers should be working on the basis that the 21 days of advertising has to have finalized. And so that has to be completed before submission. So it's not a situation where an application can be filed midway through the advertising process with the expectation that the advert simply continues. So I think this is the practical reality of the framework that's really going to land with employers. So when you factor in preparing and improving the advert, 21-day advertising period, preparing the application, reviewing applicants and processing timelines, that's where businesses should realistically be thinking in terms of at least a 4 to 6 week lead time before submission in many cases. And actually this is where we are seeing a lot of value in our total integrated business model, because we aren't supporting just the immigration filing itself, but we would do the advert coordination, applicant tracking, and then documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will add to this, if anybody is, shameless plug, if anybody is interested in seeing the scope of those services, will support the recruitment, not agency recruitment, but actually supporting that part of the process. We've actually been doing that for years, and it isn't actually that expensive either. And it will not only provide you with the support that you need, either while you get used to it or ongoing, but more importantly, it's going to provide you with the documentation that you'll need to record that process. We have had another question come through regarding temporary work permits. So for a temporary work permit of say 2 or 6 months, will they require 21 days advertising?
No, you don't need to advertise for temporary work permits. And actually, we will get onto that in another slide. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I think still talking about advertising, one area I know people are still trying to get very comfortable with, and I can see some questions already coming through, is the content, because of the subsequent cost now involved. How detailed do these newspaper adverts actually have to be?
Yeah, so we are still continuing to wait for some final operational guidance from work on how detailed the print ad should be. So we're just recommending a conservative approach right now. At minimum, adverts should clearly reflect the job title, key responsibilities and qualifications, salary range. They've actually just recently posted work hours on a monthly basis. Qualifications and years of experience and skills, how to apply, and the application deadline, and also contact details on that ad. And the key point here is consistency. So the advert, employment contract, and immigration application must all align. Okay. So I think it sounds like the safest approach here is we need to plan early. We don't need to overcomplicate it. A lot of this we are already doing, or we should have already been doing, but we definitely don't need to undercook this either. Absolutely. Yeah, I would treat the Jobs Cayman posting as the core compliance document, and ensure that the newspaper ad is it. The newspaper ad could direct applicants to the fuller Jobs Cayman advert, or even the careers page.
Okay, yeah, and actually it's worth mentioning we did submit a formal suggestion to work recently for the use of QR codes or URL links within those newspaper ads, driving you to, say, a careers page or something like that, so that you can put a smaller advert in and be more mindful of costs. And they did acknowledge it and say they are putting it under consideration. So that's really good news. Fingers crossed on that, but we'll monitor it and let our clients know as we know.
Absolutely. I just want to respond to a question that's asking about advertising on the 13th, 20th and 27th of May. When is the earliest that you could submit a permit? So obviously it would be when those ads are finalised, and if there are any Caymanian applicants, just to make sure that those applicants are responded to. So as long as that's all finalised, then you can submit that permit.
Great, thank you, Jules. So moving on, we're going to move on to fees, which is always a popular topic. What has actually changed when it comes to work permit costs themselves?
Yeah, so one of the key shifts is that employers now need to think about immigration costs more holistically. So it's no longer just the annual work permit fee, which you'll see on the slide. They haven't actually changed, but it's also, as we've spoken about, the longer advertising periods, the newspaper advertising costs, and then dependent related fees and additional filing obligations, which you'll see the tiered on the file. So what we are encouraging employers to do is seek advice earlier in the recruitment process rather than waiting until submission stage.
Okay, thank you. I think another area that we've had quite a few questions on is dependents.
Yeah.
Can we get a new slide? Can you talk us through these new income thresholds and what employers should be and employees should be aware of?
Sure. So at the moment, the general position is that if you want to add one dependent to your work permit, the household monthly income should be 5,000 CI. And then if you want to add an additional dependent, it should be an additional 1,000. So if you want 2 dependents on your work permit, it's going to be 6,000 CI. So combined monthly or household income can generally be considered for married couples, people in civil partnerships, etc. Obviously, this has to be properly documented. But from an employer perspective, you should be thinking about salary and compensation packages or structures, because they're going to become increasingly important, particularly when an employee's got family.
Or relocating. Yeah. I know there's still some uncertainty around existing dependents upon renewal. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That remains one of the biggest practical questions at the moment. So we are still waiting for clearer guidance on this around the transitional or grandfathered cases at this stage. So where the individuals fall under the renewal. So that's a work in progress.
Okay. And so if someone, I know I've had a few of these questions just recently, but so if someone's really close to the threshold, say, I don't know, 4,500, what do I do? Do I check early? What's the advice?
Yeah, absolutely. I would do a proactive review of the salary structure, allowances, household structure, and income, because that can often identify issues early. And I would do it, allow time to address it way before submission or renewal.
Okay. So I can see quite a few questions coming through regarding what we touched on earlier. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about timelines specifically, because this is where we're seeing a lot of operational impact. I know certainly, as a business owner, I feel that as well. So how should employers now think about permit routes and those overall timelines?
Yeah, so employers do need to approach permit routes much more strategically than before. So they realistically do need to build time in for workforce planning, the advertising period, applicant review, permit strategy discussion, and then obviously the processing of the permit itself. So selecting the current route at the outset is going to be increasingly important, because it's going to affect timing, cost, dependent eligibility, and long-term options for the employee.
Okay. And just to clarify, especially as a recruitment agent, temporary work permits are still there, but they're now intended for short-term assignments and things, not like a workaround.
Exactly. Yeah. So the intention appears to be that the employees use the correct route from the outset. So a genuine temporary permit would literally be things like a secondment, a temporary placement with an agency, or a short-term placement such as a limited admission for a law firm.
Okay. So like a maternity cover, long-term sick, something like that.
Exactly. Yes.
So not the quick fix it was perceived as before, shall we say?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the broader direction of the framework is encouraging employers to invest more heavily in local recruitment, succession planning, workforce development, rather than relying on short-term mobility solutions.
Yeah. And I noticed on the slides there, the 14-day timeline. Now, my understanding is that really does depend on that application being complete at submission. We see a lot of that in social media about compliance.
Yeah.
What happens if it's not? We all make mistakes, right? Well, not CML, but we all make mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, the expedited route does depend on the application being fully prepared and internally consistent. So missing documents or inconsistencies are going to very quickly impact timelines. So you could be looking at a deferral or worst case refusal. It's also worth noting that expedited filing fees for temporary work permits under the new framework have actually tripled. So employers will likely want to reserve this for situations where there's a genuine operational need.
Yeah, I can imagine. And before we move on, there's been a question which is semi-related about the proposed accreditation system, which we saw in the newspaper obviously this week. Is this something that we should be thinking about now, even though it's not come in yet?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it hasn't been fully implemented, but I do think it's worth employers keeping an eye on it, because it does align very closely with the broader direction of this new framework. So the program appears to be geared towards recognizing businesses that are demonstrating being a good corporate citizen. So investment in Caymanian recruitment, training, development, and long-term workforce planning. So there's also been discussion about accredited employers being afforded shorter permit processing routes in certain circumstances. So of course, we're waiting for further guidance on that. So I think that employers that are invested in strong HR practices, training pathways, and Caymanian developments will likely place themselves in a stronger position moving forward.
Yeah, and I think I'm happy to shameless plug and add in here, our HR consulting team are able to support clients in this way in terms of looking at assessments and projects around, in that employment development, promotion, succession strategies, and looking at like tailored recommendations to align with what could be in this new system, or when it of course comes along. But please do reach out if anybody's interested in hearing more about that. It's you can be ready for those evolving requirements and not sort of catching up on it. So moving on, probably one of the most talked about areas, because it affects both employers and employees very much is Section 64, which is like job mobility. How should employers and employees be interpreting this new 2-year rule in practice?
Yeah, at a high level, the intention appears to reduce short-term job hopping and create a stronger workforce stability. So the current interpretation is generally where someone changes employment and receives a new work permit on or after the 1st of May. With the new regime, they're expected to remain with that employer for 2 years. There are exceptions. It would be things like the natural expiry of your contract, the employer related release, redundancy situations, and then extenuating circumstances, things like bullying, harassment, or workplace infractions. That obviously has to be supported by evidence. And in these extenuating circumstances, employees should be aware that there's a very short window of opportunity there. You've only got 3 days. So within the 3 working days of resignations in some scenarios, and work actually published a form. So there's a form in which you can do that. But just as a broader point as well, the application forms themselves have changed. So again, there's this 21-day grace period. So I would encourage employers to look out for that as well.
And this is one of those areas I talked about earlier where we do need to be a little bit cautious because the guidelines and everything isn't all aligned yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's one of those areas where the legislation, operational guidance, and practical application are not yet fully aligned in that scenario. So these matters really do need to be looked at on a case by case.
Okay. Actually, there is a question here that's come through. So excuse me, I'm going to read it. I recently arrived on island on a temporary work permit, and I'm now submitting a full work permit. The role I've taken is for a more junior position than I would have applied for back in the other country, and I'm now concerned I won't be able to leave this position if something became available that aligns with my experience in the next 2 years. What would your interpretation of the rules be if my current employer was to agree to me leaving by mutual consent? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Obviously, as we've just spoken about, that this is still evolving, and potentially, I mean, there is some guidelines on this. This potentially could be another situation that the director of work justifies as an exemption, especially if the current employer has, favorably released the person. But we would just be taking these on a case-by-case basis at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. So it wouldn't be 2026 without moving on to some kind of compliance chat. Termination obligations, they've tightened quite a bit. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So this is another area where employers really do need to tighten their processes. So the framework places a much greater emphasis on timely reporting of a termination of employment. So you must notify work within 7 days of that termination as an employer. So from a practical perspective, immigration and HR processes need to align really tightly with this. And this is an area where we are actively supporting our clients, to recommend the correct reporting steps are followed.
Okay, and so this is really now, it's a formal requirement and with real penalties.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it's no longer being treated as an admin housekeeping step. It's a formal compliance obligation, and there's significant penalties attached if it's missed. So things like a $20,000 fine or 2 years imprisonment or both.
Oh, no, thank you. Okay, so we're definitely going to do all that. And then finally, I just want to touch briefly on term limits. This came up a lot in the conversations before the call. Can married permit holders still align their term limits?
Yeah, this is another area where there's a lot of discussion still in the background about it, and there's still some uncertainty about around the legislation. So historically, married permit holders were able to align their term limits, especially if one of them had a shorter term limit. But under the updated framework, alignment, the position is much more restrictive, and it's much more dependent on specific circumstances involved. So at the moment, we're recommending that these cases, again, need to be followed on a case-by-case basis, individually assessed, rather than just assuming that you can align your term limits. Yeah.
And again, this is one of those areas where guidance and operational practice aren't fully aligned yet.
Absolutely, yeah. It's one of those areas where employees and employers should seek advice on a case-by-case basis rather than just rely on historic practice.
Okay. Well, I think we have time. Timekeeper, do we have time? We have time. I can see another question now. I think this relates back to the need to advertise for jobs. If you have a PR or an RERC applicant, is there any need to advertise since they do not need a work permit?
No, you don't need to advertise for PR or RERC, no.
Okay, excellent. I think we actually managed to answer all of the questions. I'm surprised. That's good. Great stuff. So mindful of time, we said we would keep to half an hour, so we will do. But just before we finish things up, Juliette, do you have any closing remarks or thoughts for us?
Yeah, the key message is not that the system has become unworkable. It's just that employers now need to approach immigration with much more planning, stronger documentation, and closer alignment between HR and immigration processes. So businesses that stay organized and proactive are going to be able to navigate this framework. From our side, that's where we support clients. So we help them navigate not just the applications themselves, but the wider HR compliance, workforce planning considerations that come with this new framework.
Yeah, this new framework's really going to require advice, not just processing.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
Absolutely, which we're here for. So thank you so much, Juliette. And thank you to all of you that have attended today. And for those of you who are already clients for your ongoing business, it's always appreciated. We will be in touch very soon about the dates for the next Ask Me Anything, which will be centered around residency and status pathway changes. So please keep in touch with us throughout all of these changes. We are here at the other end of the phone. We know not everything is immediately clear, but as soon as we know, we promise that you will. But thank you so much for attending, and we hope you have a good rest of the day. Sorry about the technical faults.